everybody. So my theory integration was over integrating the job characteristics model with the theory of planned behavior. So we're just going to kind of go through the theories by themselves and then talk about the integration and then the implications and then wrap it all up. So why integrate the theories? So I think the theories should be integrated to illustrate if the fulfillment of the core job characteristics can lead to behaviors that influence the personal and work outcomes. So the main question is, can the design of the job influence behavioral intentions and behaviors? So the job characteristics model was originally a work redesign theory that wanted to look at the interaction between the characteristics of the individual and the characteristics of the job, and how this interaction can lead to either favorable or unfavorable work outcomes. And there's three main components of the job characteristics: the critical psychological states, and then the personal work outcomes. So I'm going to try and quickly go through this because we talked about it in class a little bit. So the first three core job dimensions, skill variety, task identity, and task significance, lead into experience meaningfulness. So skill variety is the ability that the individual has on the job to use multiple different talents or skills to complete the task. Task identity is their ability to be assigned to a task and to be able to complete an identifiable piece of work from start to finish, so they can identify with the work and they know when there was a clear beginning and end and they were able to accomplish that. And then task significance is kind of the relevance or significance to the job to others. So if we think about this with medical professionals like doctors and nurses, they have high task significance because they're saving lives. But this is also kind of subjective, so it just depends on the individual. These three characteristics lead to experience meaningfulness, which is how meaningful or important the individual finds their job to them. And then autonomy is the individual's ability to have discretion or to plan tasks and how the tasks will be carried out, and they can do that on their own. And this leads to the critical psychological state of the experienced responsibility of outcomes, which is essentially the individual feels responsible for the work that they have completed. And then feedback is the information that the individual gains from others about how they were performing the task. So if they were performing a good or bad, they get feedback on how they were doing, which just leads to the knowledge of results. So if they know if they're doing well or not. And then the moderator of growth needs strength moderates the relationship between the characteristics and the states, and then the states and the outcomes. So growth needs strength. If an individual is high on growth needs strength, this means they are high on wanting to develop and learn and continue to grow as a person. And then when individuals are high on growth needs strength, they can experience the outcomes of high motivation, performance, and satisfaction, and low absenteeism and turnover. Keep in mind, though, that Hackman and Oldman did say that you don't have to have growth needs strength to experience these outcomes. However, individuals who do have growth needs strength experience them at a higher level. So then we have the theory of planned behavior, which is an extension of the theory of reasoned action, which originally asked the question, what determines intentions to perform behavior? So what are the behavioral determinants that lead to intentions to perform a behavior? In the theory of reasoned action, this was originally the attitudes and the subjective norms as two determinants. However, the difference between this and the theory of planned behavior is that the theory of planned behavior added the determinant of perceived behavioral control, which is like the individual, how much control they have over external factors and how this impacts their behavioral intentions. So, like I said, the theory of planned behavior has the attitudes towards the behavior, which is if the individual thinks about the behavior in a more favorable or unfavorable attitude. The subjective norms is how the individual perceives how others, if other individuals find that behavior important or not. And then perceived behavioral control accounts kind of for like the external effects on the intention to perform a behavior that the individual doesn't have control over. These three determinants, when they are high and strong and positive, they lead to behavioral intentions, which then leads to the performance of a behavior. However, perceived behavioral control also has a direct relationship on behavior, as well as an indirect relationship through behavioral intentions. And then actual behavioral control, when the actual behavioral control of an individual is high, they are more likely to perform the behavior. The three determinants are kind of formed through beliefs. So you have behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs. So behavioral beliefs are the beliefs that an individual has towards the outcome and evaluations of the outcomes towards a behavior. Normative belief is like the expectations or norms of others when you perform that behavior, and this also kind of has a motivational component to it to comply with that behavior. And then control beliefs are essentially the same as perceived behavioral control, so just what are the factors in the environment that either enable or obstruct the individual from performing a behavior. And these beliefs are influenced by different background factors from the individual's social and information realms. So here is the integrated model of the job characteristics and theory of planned behavior. I'm going to kind of go through the propositions. It looks like a lot, but there's only 5 propositions that kind of tie this model together. So, Proposition 1A states that the critical psychological state of experienced meaningfulness will influence the extent to which an individual forms attitudes about a behavior. So when an individual has their core dimensions of skill variety, task identity, and task significance fulfilled, this leads to experienced meaningfulness. And if we remember, experienced meaningfulness is the extent to which an individual finds their job meaningful or they care about their job. So when an individual cares about their job, they're more likely to form a more positive attitude towards their work based off of the characteristics being fulfilled. And Ackman and Oldman said that task identity is the highest predictor of job performance, so that kind of helps reiterate the fact that the fulfillment of task identity along with these other 3 characteristics can lead to behaviors on the job. So, Proposition 1B states that the critical psychological state of knowledge of results will influence the perception of subjective norms or social acceptability towards the behavior. So, when feedback leads to the knowledge of the results, the individual has feedback on how are they performing on a certain job task. So when individuals receive feedback about how they're doing on the job, if this feedback is good, then they know that the behaviors that they are doing towards this job are favorable towards other individuals, kind of forming that subjective norm. So they perceive that other individuals see this behavior as positive or valuable to the organization. But if maybe they had negative results, then they can kind of figure out, oh, this behavior is not valued by the organization, so it forms a subjective norm of the behavior not being favorable to others. Proposition 1C is the critical psychological state of felt responsibility will influence the perceived behavioral control of an individual. So going back, felt responsibility is determined through the fulfillment of autonomy. And so the amount of autonomy that an individual has can shape the amount of perceived behavioral control they feel that they have. So if an individual has higher autonomy and higher felt responsibility on the job, so they feel responsible for the outcomes, they're going to have higher perceived behavioral control on the intention to form the behavior. Autonomy may also help the individual see that they do have adequate resources in their control to perform the behaviors. Now, if maybe their autonomy is low, then they're not going to feel that they have perceived control over the situation, so they may not perform the behavior. And then we have Proposition 2A. So Proposition 2A states that acting on behaviors leads to outcomes of high satisfaction and motivation. So this proposition was kind of hard to find some support for, so I had to think about it in a different way. So I looked to leadership research, and so with leadership research, the idea behind this was that how leaders behave influences their employees or followers' motivation and satisfaction. So leaders who are more likely to exhibit behaviors of self-confidence, high energy, power, and assertiveness, and like compassion towards their employees, kind of increases in the employee their motivation and satisfaction based on these leader behaviors. So if we think about it in this way, leaders would have high attitudes towards their behaviors, subjective norms, as well as perceived behavioral control, which would make them want to behave in these constructive and positive ways towards their employees, which influences the motivation and satisfaction of the employees rather than the individual. So if we think about it like that with that type of research, then this kind of supports this proposition. And then finally, Proposition 2B. So when individuals are highly motivated and satisfied, this encourages the individual to have higher performance and lower absenteeism. So as we can kind of assume, and we already know that when individuals are more motivated and satisfied, this leads to more positive outcomes, not only for the individual, but the organization as a whole. So when we have high motivation and high satisfaction, this is going to lead to better performance for the individual, which would lead to better performance of the organization, as well as lower absenteeism. Hackman and Oldham also mentioned that the outcomes of high performance and low absenteeism are actually stronger when they are measured through motivation and satisfaction. So that kind of reiterates this proposition, since high internal motivation and satisfaction are forming high performance and low absenteeism. So implications in future research. So one of the implications of this integrated model would be kind of redesigning jobs to increase positive behavioral intentions as well, leading to positive behaviors. So you should be able to use it to redesign jobs in a way that increases positive attitudes and behaviors and outcomes. You can redesign it based on the job characteristics model by increasing the importance of the critical psychological states, so individuals increasing the importance of the core job dimensions, which lead to the critical psychological states, which would help form the behavioral determinants, giving the individuals positive intentions to perform behaviors leading to the personal and work outcomes. It could also be used as a diagnostic tool for negative behaviors. So if there's behaviors that aren't really valued by the organization or they're in a way counterproductive, you could go back to the root of the job design with the job characteristics model and kind of figure out what needs to be fulfilled in order to increase positive behaviors and decrease the negative behaviors that are happening within the organization. And then future research implications. So there was actually a feedback loop, which was an assumption that was proposed in the most recent theory of planned behavior, stating that the performance of behaviors and the outcomes of that can actually feed back into influencing the behavioral intentions as well as the behaviors and the background factors that form the beliefs. So future research should look at how this feedback loop, can actually play into this, and if the integrated model has an effect on that as well. And then finally, there should be more research to support Proposition 2A, considering it's hard to find research on how a behavior would lead to motivation or satisfaction, because typically it's opposite. So they could do this through looking at more leadership research or kind of making it more general to the workplace. And then the conclusion. So overall, The integration of this theory could change the root design of a job and kind of facilitate the 5 core job characteristics that lead to the psychological states. And by experiencing the impact of the psychological states, the individuals can form positive attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control to form strong behavioral intentions towards the behavior. And then these intentions would lead to the behavior that are beneficial to the worker and the workplace, which leads to more positive outcomes. And that's all I have.